So welcome to the February 7th Orono Town Council meeting. We're meeting with the Community Development Committee and the Finance and Operations Committee this afternoon. Joining me here in council are Councilor Robertson and Councilor Wingard. And joining us via Zoom is Councilor Gardner. Community Development Committee is first on the agenda, and that's normally chaired by Terry, who is unable to be with us tonight, and graciously, Councilor Gardner has agreed to step in his place. So, Councilor Gardner.
Okay, hello. All right, so the first and only item for Community Development Committee meeting tonight is Part A, Council discussion identifying priorities and next steps for developing a formal town plan related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, Council did receive a number of draft documents shortly before the meeting, and though I'm happy to work those into the conversation, the intention was not to focus entirely on those draft documents tonight, but rather to review the other documents that we discussed last week. So that would be, just to refresh folks' memory, we did have a list of recommendations from our ad hoc DEI committee over the summer. And last week we had a presentation from town staff talking about some of the strengths, the weaknesses, the challenges in staff implementing certain changes, and also a little bit of discussion around changes that have already been ongoing. And so we had a chance to review that document over the last week. So our goal here tonight is to think about, to identify what our priorities are in terms of taking next steps. And hopefully the draft documents that we received today that we can work into the conversation a little bit as well, we will be able to then bring forward for a more robust conversation once we've had the opportunity to really dive into them, or for folks who haven't worked on them already to dive into them. Sophie, was that a good enough intro to kick off a conversation, or do you have anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I have nothing to add. I think you did a great job. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so who'd like to dive in?
I'll dive in.
Good.
Hopefully the camera will show you to me, Cheryl. I can only see Jeff right now for some reason.
I have no idea how to get this owl. Oh, I could scoot over, I guess.
I think it moves when you talk.
Oh, it does? Okay.
Yeah.
Is it moving now?
Yep.
There we go. Okay, okay. I know you said, Megan, that we just got these draft documents a couple hours ago. But I want to kind of start with the first, the matrix that Jeff asked for and got. And I actually want to say that, first of all, a ton of work to put all of this together, but it actually helped clear up a few things for me. So I'm hoping that our community can see this as well at some point, because I feel like I also went back and re-watched the presentation of the ad hoc committee on September 13th, just to kind of get a feel for this again, to come back to this again. And having the two following up with what the town is doing, because that was one of probably my biggest issue with the ad hoc committee, was that we were doing things already. And the repeated charge was, well, we weren't charged, that wasn't our charge to be informed about what the town was doing already. So I feel like we are now informed about what the town is doing already. And piggybacking that with the staff report that we got last week. And I liked also that one of the statements, the September 13th meeting, was that towns must work within the protocols and confines of municipal government. And so so now we have a baseline. Now I feel like we have a baseline. I feel like we have a benchmark. I feel like we have a foundation. And the foundation was what I was hoping for at the beginning of this, however many years ago it was now. So I'm going to leave it at that because that's kind of the research that I was doing, and I appreciate the matrix. I actually kind of liked the comparison of what we were doing. So it really brought that out for me.
Thank you, Cheryl. Other folks?
Well, I requested some of this work be done, and I'm really impressed that the ongoing work the town's doing. Very thankful for what Sophie brought to light in this document. It was a whole lot of work, extra work to put it together in a very short amount of time. And it helped me identify areas where we seem to be making progress, and also maybe one or two areas that we should talk about as a council. It doesn't mean that if there's, it doesn't mean that if the boxes don't match up, like the ad hoc committee had made a recommendation or the town is taking an action and they don't completely align, it doesn't mean that one side is necessarily right or wrong. But for me, that was informative to see that in most areas there's quite a bit of alignment, but in one or two areas there's some non-alignment, I guess I'd say. There's some, misunderstanding or miscommunication between those lines.
So Jeff, as we prepare for a follow-up meeting where we really get thorough with that matrix, and potentially discuss whether we would like to share it, with the public as well, which I do think would be a good idea. Would you, in preparation for that meeting, would you be willing to kind of highlight or dig into those areas that you think there are those kind of miscommunications or it doesn't quite match up, and we can really dive into that?
Yeah, I think that would be a great place to start.
Perfect. Thank you. Other folks?
I agree with about everything that Cheryl and Jeff said. I think we have a good basis to move forward on. I think there are some areas that need some more attention, but there are areas that have gotten some really significant attention, which I'm real pleased with, and some things that were ongoing anyway.
Right.
So I think it's a matter of, as Jeff said, looking at where things don't quite align, but also looking at where, going back to what Cheryl said, some of the recommendations may, although they might be excellent recommendations, may not really be in our wheelhouse. And it's okay to say this is something that just isn't municipal responsibility. So I think that's another avenue that we need to keep in mind.
We'll have some budget.
Yes, I have some comments on the budget part, but Lori, did you have anything you wanted to jump in with?
I appreciate the work, and I was in meetings until 5. And so when this came at 3, I didn't have those 2 hours available to review it. So I'm looking forward to reading it, and I can give you my comments after that.
Oh, sorry, Lori, you missed my intro. So those draft documents, what I said to folks was like, it's okay for us to talk about them tonight if we want to a little bit, but we didn't receive them until 2 hours ago. So we're not expected to really do a deep dive on any of them here in this meeting. The purpose of this meeting is more to talk about the document that was presented by staff last week and published on the website regarding staff strengths, weaknesses, priorities around DEI. To have a more substantive conversation about that document that we've had the week to review.
Yes, and then that night, Jeff asked for a matrix so that we could see what was requested and what we're actually doing. And so with what was given to us last week and what we got today, it seems like that for me, I need to look at those before I make any more comments. As I said last week, I thought they did a wonderful job, and I was really appreciated them giving the presentation and putting it into the format that is commonly used in municipalities to determine how they're doing and what they could do better. And so I did hear your introduction that we all only got it 2 hours ago, but it sounded as if Cheryl actually might have had some time to look at it. I didn't have time to look at it.
So to kind of follow up on what I was saying about budgetary items, when I look at that matrix and also the staff presentation, what really comes through for me is again, the large volume of things that are already being done or are in progress already, that are tied into those recommendations. And that a lot of the missing pieces either fall into the category that Tom was mentioning, where it's not really it's not really possible to address that at a municipal level, for whatever reason. But largely budget, like there are a lot of the missing pieces. When I look at that matrix, a lot of the big missing pieces are really money or related to money, funding new things that we haven't funded before, or funding things in different ways. And so I think that, for me, working through these documents and as we head into budget season, I think that it's important for us and for the public, for the residents, to be having a really frank conversation about allocating funds. Because when I listened to candidates night, for example, I heard a lot of like add programs and lower the tax rate. I would love that. But also, how does one do that? I don't know. One does that by making cuts in other places. So I think that, like, I see this going forward in the spring as, really having some difficult conversations around priorities and where allocating funds is going to go, because it does seem like a lot of the things in the matrix that aren't being directly addressed at this point would need to be funded significantly, or that staff time would need to be reallocated. So that is a big conversation to have as we dive into this matrix. The other thing I wanted to touch on is that the DEI ad hoc committee, one of the things I want to share Cheryl's frustration, and I said a little bit of this last week, but it was almost kind of like they were operating, with a lack of knowledge about the technical side of things, that what staff was like. Staff has the operational knowledge and the DEI committee was not aware of that, right? So I've come to look at the DEI ad hoc list of recommendations as kind of like a best practices in a way, like in absence of the information about what town staff is already doing. They gave us a really comprehensive list on like, what would the ideal town be doing? Like, what would the ideal scenario be in a town like Orono with the community that it has? And so the matrix is allowing us to look at the ways in which we kind of are meeting some of those goals already, and then showing us, where we may not be meeting those goals in terms of what best practices might be. And so I think that the matrix and the DEI ad hoc committee's recommendations is just a really good marriage to show us, like where we are and where we might want to go. On the subject of where we might want to go, next week, of course, we are going to dig into the matrix, and also you received a draft copy of the DEI toolkit that I put together over the summer, beginning of the fall, that we haven't had a chance to really dive into yet. But the purpose of this committee meeting is to, kind of drill down a little bit on what we want to focus in terms of our next steps. So I didn't know if folks, obviously we're going to review those documents we received today and have a thorough discussion about that in the near future. But I wanted to open it up to give folks a chance to talk about what other kind of priorities they wanted to prioritize or suggest to the council that we focus on.
I think one of the recommendations that was listed first on their list is something we really need to talk about in more detail, and that was the recommendation to have a more permanent advisory committee. While I'm not sure that all of the bullets under that are things that necessarily would go with the committee, I think we really need to give that some serious consideration I really want to just pick up, Megan, on something you mentioned in terms of the recommendations from the ad hoc committee being kind of the ideal. And I see that too, but that's a good thing. I think that, that gives us something to aspire to, something to say, this isn't quite in our wheelhouse and we're not going to focus on that so much, but that I'm glad they gave up a more ideal scenario. Now we got to get down to what can we reasonably, realistically do, and what can we afford to do, and but I'm glad that we have that to look at.
Yeah, and kind of aligning with that, what you'll see when you dig into the toolkit is that one of the sort of driving motivators of the actual worksheet that's in the toolkit is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all kind of, worksheet to make sure that you are hitting all of these targets when you're considering policy action or programming or operational actions, but rather to make sure that that conversation is always at the front of your mind when you are discussing policy or operational changes. That those questions are questions that you are asking yourself, even if the answer is, well, this doesn't really apply in this scenario. You're still asking yourself the question. And that's the important part, that those things are at the front of our minds, council and staff alike, when we are discussing making changes to policy and operation. And so I think of this best practices or ideal scenario in a similar way. Like, maybe it's not possible for us to keep a regional calendar of events or to sponsor as many events as the community wishes the town could manifest. But if it's on the, if it's at the front of our minds, we're always looking for an opportunity that maybe we can meet that need in some way if an opportunity arises. So I'm glad to have that as well, Tom. Thank you. Other folks?
I think just to reiterate what Tom said, the very first decision or the very first discussion that we probably need to have is, and following the background, the email that Sophie sent, is I kind of go over in my head, what is this committee's overarching purpose? And I can never come up with an answer. So for a permanent committee, to do this, and a DEI committee, I can't come up with an overarching purpose, and I've asked many times, like, what would the purpose be for this? And so I think that's a first place to start.
Well, it seems clear to me that the purpose is to continue focusing on this and all of the things that were listed. So, and one of the things listed was to promote awareness of unique town services that residents may not use on a regular basis, like having a civil rights liaison or public health officer. So we don't have those things.
Okay. Stop. What would the charge be? Let's use different language, because even what you just said, Lori, is still vague to me. So
Okay.
What would the charge be? What would to provide something, to advise, to what kind of language does this theoretical committee, it's still fuzzy to me. To focus doesn't mean anything to me, but to provide a service, to assist. I mean, I'm not interested in a committee telling council what to do.
Well, I guess the corollary would be an environment committee. So before we had an environment committee, the town was definitely concerned about the environment, and the town management, whenever we have a really great track record, or they do, with writing grants to support things that we're doing in the town to help offset the costs, so to keep our tax dollars down. And when something came up that had to do with the environment that fit in with programs, things we were working on, I'm sure our town applied for it. So we weren't bereft of having things related to the environment before we had an environment committee. because we
Okay,
have a
what-
talented
so
staff
what-
and they look for things. So we are not, and I still maintain, we are not bereft of things related to our staff thinking about equity and inclusion, nor is the council bereft of thinking about equity and inclusion. But once a committee is created, as the committee you created, then we have a group of citizens who that is their primary focus, that over regular meetings will be discussing the issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how that goal of having equity, diversity, and inclusion intersects with us being a municipality. So I'm not sure why you can't get your mind around that, because you just did that. And before you came to council, there was a discussion that we didn't want any more committees because they took staff time, and that would then have extra costs because the staff is so great at serving when we have committees. They do prep for it and they're present during the committee. And so there's definitely a cost to having another committee, but there's so many benefits, as your committee has shown us, how many benefits there are to having, in addition to the staff, in addition to the elected councilors, prominent members of the community who consider this what they want to do for their volunteer work. So that it seems to me that you get the right group of people, and it's a net benefit to our town, so we can achieve these goals in more focus, more detail, and more effectively and more quickly than we would without having the committee.
Cheryl, I would like to dive in with perhaps a solution, because I had the same question. And Lori, I'm not sure. I understand what Cheryl's saying, and I don't know if it's not. If I just happen to be on the same wavelength as what she's talking about, but a lot of. So I want to preface this by saying that in the wake of George Floyd's murder, there were a lot of companies and cities and towns who immediately poofed into existence DEI committees who did not have specific charges. And in my research for putting together this toolkit, I've looked at a lot of different municipalities who created the quickest DEI committee they could manage. And I understand the urgency. I feel the urgency as well. And I know our community feels the urgency. However, looking in on those as I work through this research, some of them seem to be pretty dormant. They seem to be pretty unfocused or not meeting frequently anymore. And I don't think any of our residents want that. And I don't think any of our counselors want that either for Orono. So when Cheryl says, well, what is this committee supposed to do? I think, Lori, that you've really articulated the overarching broad strokes of what such a committee would do. But with Cheryl's committee, for an example, there's a specific charge. And then that charge was rewritten to refocus that committee this year. And I think that one of the things we've all been struggling with is what would be the specific charge of that committee, because just creating a committee and saying like, well, it just looks at these big issues, that's very broad. And I think it's not setting that committee up for success. I think it's doing a disservice to the community members who would volunteer for such a committee to not really give them clear guidance on what it is that they are supposed to do as part of that committee. So my kind of not a compromise, but like to bring both of you together on this point. For me, and what I was going to recommend or suggest to see if council had an appetite for it is, when I was going through the matrix today, boy, that sounds weird every time I say it out loud. When I was going through the matrix, I'm in the matrix. None of this is real. We're all in a computer farm. Anyway, when I was going through the matrix today, I was thinking a lot about, well, is this something that could be handled or dealt with or covered by a JEDI committee? Is this the sort, like, for example, one item from the matrix was the recruitment of diverse candidates for municipal jobs. So town staff are reviewing the job postings now. They're in that process. But of course, as we well know, we all have blind spots. And so one of the benefits of having a JEDI committee could be that a specific action item for them would be to work with staff on job postings to make sure that we are not unintentionally discouraging or limiting any applicants, and that we are casting the widest net possible and trying to recruit a diverse workforce. So as I'm reading the matrix, I'm thinking, oh, that could be something that was part of a charge, or that could be something that's part of a charge. And so what I was wondering is if council wanted to dive into the toolkit and the matrix and have a thorough substantive conversation about those documents and what we might change or tweak about them, or where we might, ask staff to provide some information, and use those documents to start formulating a charge for a JEDI committee. And I'm not really sure, I'm sure that Sophie might have a better idea than me. I'm not sure in a practical way how we would do this, whether there is a shared document that counselors could work on to submit, what they think part of the charge should be, or what's important to them that stands out to them. But it seems like to me, the matrix and the toolkit, in addition to the other materials that we've seen, but specifically those documents, could really help us dial down on a specific charge for a JEDI committee. And I'm just curious to know if folks think that would be a good order of things.
Megan, I think that's an excellent suggestion. I think it's a great place to start with this work. One thing I would add is that a committee like this can not only be operational in some way to assist the town in our DEI goals, but it can also be a great source of information for town staff and for council. So one thing that I'm hoping that we can build into this discussion of how we're going to frame this committee is a periodic, regular, but not too frequent, maybe quarterly, maybe biannually, listening session where the committee can bring to council their observations, so that the work of the ad hoc committee isn't left in 2021, so that we have continuing recommendations on how we can improve our practices, as well as getting whatever operational support we can from committee members. Does that make sense?
That makes
Oh,
sense.
yes, yeah.
I think two good ideas from both Megan and Jeff. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate the ways in which, there could be specific practical operational things that such a committee could work on, but also, as you'll see when you dive into the toolkit, there are going to be times that we have, for example, policy initiatives that we ourselves, as a council of, well, currently a council largely comprised of white people, might not be able to answer. We might not be able to answer specific questions when we're looking at a specific policy initiative, or we might say, well, I guess it might impact different communities this way or that way, but we don't know, and we aren't the experts on that. So there are also like a lot of opportunities, I think, to kind of bring the committee in for that kind of feedback as well. But yeah, and yes, Jeff, I love the suggestion of that kind of a check-in. And there are a lot of recommendations in the toolkit and in a lot of these toolkits in a lot of different cities about sort of a yearly accountability piece, where that is reviewing the goals that you set for yourself as a municipality, both on the policy level and on the operations level, and then reviewing whether or not you have met those goals, if you've fallen short and why, or if you've exceeded or met those goals. And I think that that's another thing that we could bring into the committee charge. But again, I think a lot of these documents will help us come up with some really specific items for the charge, so that we can really move this process forward on creating the committee. Other folks?
Yeah, I think what I brought to the council back in the winter of 2017, 2018 was the request that Sophie made to me about the Human Rights Campaign. And in the Human Rights Campaign's scorecard for municipalities, it had suggested some kind of committee. They called it a Civil Rights Committee, but I guess new terminology, we're calling it a JEDI Committee. And one of the charges that they suggest that was common was an educational piece, cultural piece, so that this committee takes because it would take staff time at the town to create some event or some educational, and we are an academic town, so perhaps it would be seminars, learning opportunities to learn about people who live in our community. And so that would be, for example, part of what the charge could be, is to create this opportunity for people in the community to learn about other people in the community. So that's, and I believe that I haven't, again, looked at the report since that the DEI committee did. There's pieces of it now broken out into the matrix, but I do believe that education and cultural events was part of things that they were suggesting. So that's, it seems like there's a lot, and I agree with you, Megan, that reviewing policies is a good use of this committee. Much as we have the planning board reviews things before it comes to us, or we send things to the planning board, that they're a separate entity that is our advisor. In the same way, this JEDI committee could be a separate entity that advises us.
So if I'm hearing correctly, if the purpose of this agenda item is next steps, so it sounds like everyone's on board with taking some time to dive into the matrix and the toolkit, not only to kind of come up with discussion points about things that you like about these documents, things where you think something might be missing, or you might want to change something, or, you know, as Jeff was pointing out, a couple of areas that, you know, he saw where the town could jump into some opportunities. And we'll have a substantive conversation at a near future meeting about those two documents, but also use those documents to launch into creating the charge for a JEDI committee, figuring out a practical way for us all to collaborate on this charge might be something I would ask our big staff brains for help with. Sophie?
If I can jump in just for a minute, I have a couple of thoughts. First, as convenient as a shared document is, it is kind of like having a meeting outside of a meeting.
I was afraid you were going to
Not
say
cool. That would not be transparent governance. I would suggest that perhaps with your help, Megan, we could come up with some very specific questions that would frame our next conversation, send them out in advance, ask for people to send them back to me. I can create a document that will be discussed at the next meeting. That is how I think we kind of, it's not you guys going back and forth, it's us asking for information so we can create a document that you would get, that would be posted on the website with council background information. If we're at a point, so I did not post the draft matrix or the draft toolkit because we were right up against the wire and I wasn't sure that I was going in the right direction. If I know that that's heading in the right direction, I'm happy to post drafts so people can see them. The public can see them, which I think would maybe be good, as long as those are not my work. Those are Jeff and your work. So I want to make sure that I'm on board with where you guys are headed. The second thought I have is I don't think council's time is appropriately spent. Appropriate is a bad word. You can spend your time however you want, but I would suggest it could be more efficiently spent for, instead of thinking about what are the specifics of the charge, much like we did with the environment committee. Council didn't go line by line on a charge. You gave me a host of priorities, things that you were interested in from your conversation with Cheryl. And then I worked behind the scenes and created a charge that you could then respond to. I think that might help focus that discussion a little bit. The last thing I would ask, and this is an ask for you to think about, not me telling you what to do, because last time I checked, you were my bosses and not the other way around. When we think about the way this committee interacts with staff, when the charter was formed, the charter gave some responsibilities to council and delegated operations directly to staff. I would kind of think about that as you think about this charge. For example, I could absolutely see staff adopting a policy around inclusive hiring that included some best practices within that policy, an administrative policy, not an ordinance. We have others that guide my day-to-day work. A lot of times those bubble up from staff. I could see that being an effective thing for a committee of experts, resident experts to weigh in on and to help guide the development of. That feels very different to me than reviewing job postings that my staff and I put out, but rather giving the framework from which job postings should be delivered feels like a more appropriate delegation. And my thought is that much like the Environment Committee, when we were looking at pay recs, they learned about those. They guided staff, they helped staff with the contract. Staff brought questions that they didn't understand the answers to. And then that came to council with some recommendations. That to me seems like an effective committee use, as opposed to an outside committee directing my staff, and in this case, it would be directing me on how to put a job posting, or what a job posting looks like, or what a job description looks like. But I do think that inclusive hiring piece is important, and the next manager you have might not have experience with it, might not have had training in it. To be able to fall back on a policy makes perfect sense. I think one of the things that was suggested, not in the ad hoc committee's report, but in their presentation, and then again last night, or not last night, but last week at the council, at the candidates night, was this idea that the committee would be kind of a place where complaints about staff and operations came to. And while I completely understand the idea of having conversation with council about systemic problems, there is a due process right that happens that would really kind of create an issue for. And so I just wonder if taking the time to kind of talk about what the priorities would be would then allow me to go back, look at the charter, look at some of the potential unintended consequences or conflicts, and come back to you with some suggestions. Just because I suggest it doesn't mean you have to do it, but it would at least give you kind of a framework from which to work within. My thoughts.
Do you think that the question instrument you're gonna send us will help you develop that?
I'm hoping that it would. Because Megan's pretty good at that, so.
Yeah, that all sounds great to me, Sophie. I guess I should have been, maybe I wasn't super clear when I was talking about the job postings thing, because what I was imagining is more like what you described, not a committee like reviewing and then picking apart a job posting that has already been posted. But I'm thinking of like staff coming to the table with this committee and saying, we're really struggling. We want to do X, but we can't figure out how, or we don't have the language, or is this language excluding people and we don't know that? Like that it's more of a collaborative process, kind of the way that it is with the Environment Committee at this point, where they're there to provide expertise that staff may not have access to on those issues.
And, and the other thing too, is that when we did put the Environment Committee together, first of all, it took time. It didn't happen overnight. And second of all, we did it with under the time frame that we would put a committee together for a year. And then we would go back and that was perfectly fine. It was an ad hoc committee. We wanted to see how it would roll out and if it was beneficial, if it wasn't. And, you know, we were ready to disband if necessary, and that was fine. So having some kind of a temporary a way to see if this is actually something that is beneficiary as opposed to going dormant, like, you know, Megan said, some of these committees have kind of petered out after the initial excitement is over. And so, you know, so I would be opposed to doing some kind of a year trial, however it unfolds, and then go back and relook at it. I also see this, I also see a document, the report that Sophie put together, the diversity and equity inclusion documents as living documents and flexible, and that they need to change as we progress and as we learn. So, so in that case, I would say, if there is a charge that aligns with the protocols of municipal government, and that we can look at, and there's no conflicts, and this committee is not telling staff what to do, then I think that we can go forward and see what we can come up with. I do like the idea of combining the toolkit and this matrix as well.
Yeah, Cheryl, I agree with that. I was just, actually, it's funny you should mention that. I was just today, while I was going over my own toolkit that I submitted back in, I don't know, August or September, and I had used the phrase marginalized identities, and that has been kind of standard operating terminology for a few years. But recently I was in a board meeting for Maine Women's Lobby, and one of my fellow board members said, you know, I'm not a marginalized person. Like, maybe society has tried to marginalize me, but I am not marginalized. I'm a human being, and I prefer to use the terminology historically underrepresented. And it was like, oh yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And so just to honor and acknowledge that these are living documents. This is a living process. It should respond to the needs of the people it serves. And I think that doing a regular assessment of the committee charge, the documents related to, you know, these endeavors, that is a really healthy thing to do for this process, to make sure that it's active and alive, you know?
I agree.
So is there anything else from, oh, sorry, Tom, go ahead.
I just want to say, Sophie, I really like the suggestions you had for next steps moving forward. What are you thinking about for a timetable on that?
So I think we're getting a head of steam under us, like most of our projects do, where there's a period of time where it feels like it's dormant, but we're like ducks moving our feet under the water. But usually when something comes up, bubbles up this far, we kind of stay on it consistently so that you don't have to spend a lot of time rereading documents. When I look ahead, next week we have a regular council meeting. I would like a little bit of time to be able to work with Councilor Gardner and also to get you documents out. So I don't think we want to do a workshop next Monday. The following Monday is a holiday, and I don't know about you all, but I'm not going to be here. So I would look at February 20, February 28th as a date with a goal of having stuff out sooner, posting some of these draft documents on the website, kind of looking at that. The other thing I would,
Getting feedback from from
Yeah.
council
Yep, to be
before
able
that.
to create a concise document. The other thing I would just also suggest is, much like the environment committee, we started with a much smaller charge and we have expanded it over time. And so if you kind of thought about one way, this seems like a really big thing. One way to start it would be to say, for the next year, these are the things that we really want to try to accomplish. And then we'll come back and we'll see what worked, what didn't work. Are we now comfortable kind of creating a more boilerplate charge? I mean, that's
Right.
And one of the things I would ask people to kind of think about too is, I keep harping on committee structure, and it's not because I am a systems person, so that's probably part of it. But I think things as simple as, are we going to structure this with a council person as the chair? So staff is working with a council person to organize. Are we structuring this with just bringing a bunch of community members together who will work with the town manager, who will then decide what staff people we should bring to the table? You know, kind of what that structure looks like helps create the rest of it flowing down. Just a thought. And is this group going to report to the community development group? Is this group standalone? How is it going to work?
Lori?
Those could be some of the questions
Yeah,
that you could have to think about.
I like the model more like the planning board that does not have a council member on it and reports back to the council. Because it gives us a greater opportunity to have voices from the community and to represent diversity that we don't seem to capture, because we do have, relative to other towns in Maine outside of Portland, pretty diverse community, but we don't seem to capture that on our council. So that's what I would recommend, as opposed to although I lauded the value of an environment committee, and to say how much more that's doing for us, even though we were already a town whose staff and council cared a lot about the environment. I don't see it as analogous to the environment committee. I see it more analogous to a separate committee like the planning board.
so how council chooses to structure is completely council's decision. So I'm not trying to dissuade you, but from a technical point, the planning board has a very clear regulatory charge. The planning board does not simply offer policy advice to the council. It is supposed to be quite structured in its advice in terms of how that advice relates to the comprehensive plan and consistency with the comprehensive plan, and or how the permitting or regulatory process would play out under that policy. So a planning board is required by state law partially because it does not want the things that come before it to get intertwined with the politics that often exist in a board of elected municipal officials that are here to represent the whole town and make policy for the town. So there's a division between ordinance creation and ordinance enforcement, which is what the planning board is charged with doing. So I would just say that I would just say they're not the same.
I think another factor is the planning board is staffed by a municipal employee who has technical expertise that aligns with the charge of the planning board.
Yes,
And
very much
training.
so, very
And
much
training.
so. And a considerable amount of time is devoted to that.
But that's a valid
Yeah.
observation from Lori, something to think about.
So folks, is there anything else that anyone wants to offer on this item before we close out this committee? Lori?
Well, I didn't hear just what Tom said. It wasn't quite loud enough for me to hear.
Well, I guess I said two things. I said the planning board is staffed by our town planner, who has a lot of technical expertise that aligns with the charge of the planning board.
Right, so I heard that. There was something you said after that that I
And
missed.
that's a valid observation that Lori made and a valid suggestion that deserves some consideration.
Oh, thank you.
welcome.
Yeah, so I guess my question would just be, is there some other model of a committee that is not chaired by a council member the way the committee we're in right now or the environment committee, for example, are? Do we have other committees or advisory groups that serve the council that we might be used as a model?
I think you have to make it up. I mean, I guess that was my point in the email that I sent to council, was that right now you've got regulatory bodies that are there as a check and a balance, or have a specific purpose outside of council. And you have committees like trails, tree board, beautification, which are really volunteer committees that are appointed, but work through staff and often under the direction of staff. So not,
Standard.
it is not, they're not policy making. They tend to be people who want to get the work done and staff working with them to get the work done. So I think that there's this place in the middle that just because we don't have something there doesn't mean we can't.
Right.
Other communities do. I would suggest that we would want to be very purposeful about what would work here and what the council's goals and expectations are. Because in other communities, they have whole groups of people that meet that I think oftentimes might not even have staff. My fear for that here is that we could very quickly diverge from what's possible into what's ideal. So I think you want to have some connection either through council, formal staff. But I do think that you can do that in a way. It's just about creating something new that kind of lives between those two types of committees.
I guess just to follow up, I completely support the idea of them not having staff and diverging into, as you call it, diverging into what's ideal, because I have always maintained that I think my goal for the council is that it's the visioning arm of the municipality and that the staff is the doing arm. And so it's so much to do every day that job of being philosophical and setting goals that are far beyond the day-to-day should be in the realm of the council. And so I imagine that this JEDI committee would be advising the council on how we can fashion those long-term goals and then try to advise how to meet them and do the investigations of other communities. So the kind of work that Megan has done, that would be the JEDI committee would be doing that work, say, talking with, say, South Portland, that has been so, their JEDI committee has been so successful. And so, learning from other communities, that work would get done by this community group, whether we call it a committee or some other thing. So that's.
Lori, the phrase learning from other communities is actually a good segue. So I don't want to get into the weeds because our goal here tonight is not to solve the question of how to structure the committee, but to make sure that that's on our radar. So one thing I would encourage all counselors to do, since coming up with the charge is a very important part of the committee, equally important is how are we going to structure the committee. So one thing I would ask council to do in preparation for that conversation is to have a look at other communities and really be thinking about how those communities have more or less resources than ours and how their committee or advisory board or whatever it is that they have is functioning. A lot of us have political friends in other places who are also going through this process or have gone through this process. And so reaching out to those folks or just reading about other communities' work, looking at what other cities are doing, would bring valuable insight, I think, into the conversation to see if there is, even if the model, as Sophie said, if it doesn't exist in Orono yet, that's fine. But like, also we want to think about, is it working in other communities? And is it working because they have more money than us? Or is it working because of the structure or, what have you? So that's something I'd encourage everybody to do in preparation for that conversation. Any last comments before we close out this committee meeting?
Yes, thank you, Megan, for taking on the responsibility of leading us in this discussion on short notice. Appreciate it.
Happy to help. All right, well, with that, I will turn it over to the head of the Finance and Operations Committee.
Okay. So we have 2 items and we're going to delete one. Are we not?
Yes, we are.
So-
So the leasing library self-check and a checkout equipment, Lori has outdone herself. We had originally thought we were going to come to you with an opportunity to lease our equipment as opposed to buy it through Biblioteca, who we've used in the past. And she has found an opportunity that looks like we can buy the equipment with a subscription that will save us several $1,000s over the next 4 years, and can be done within her current budget and our spending authority. So we don't need to talk about it.
All right.
Great.
Except to say, Lori Carpenter is amazing.
Thank you, Lori
Thank you,
Carpenter.
Lori Carpenter.
So the next item is to discuss service level and operational expectations for the summer of 2022 municipal pool and Goulds Landing facilities.
So I'm gonna start, Mitch is here to back me up today. Every year, we go through a budget process that starts on July 1. There are a couple of services that we have to talk about before we get through the budget, because they involve us doing a bunch of pre-work that actually starts before July 1. And although most of the budget for them is in the next fiscal year, some is in this year, but most will be in next year. So the 2 that we want to talk with you about today are parks related, Parks and Rec related. The first one is the municipal pool. So last year, we entered into an agreement with the university for lifeguards. They managed all the training, all of the scheduling, and ensuring that we had adequate lifeguards at the pool. Because of staffing issues, which we still don't know where we're going to be, because nobody has put out for staff yet to understand if there's going to be a massive shortage the way there was last year. But because of staffing shortages and because of COVID, we kind of changed the way we would deal with the pool. We would look at protecting those core hours again this year, between 12 and 7-ish at night, Monday through Friday, are the core hours that we think are very important. We would try to add in swim lessons if that's possible. Our next step, if it were possible, would be to start expanding onto the weekend. So the idea being, our first call is safe, fully lifeguarded pool operations. The issue that we run into is that the university, while they are happy to provide lifeguards and oversight of those guards, they are not going to provide us with people who handle cash. That is simply beyond what they're comfortable doing within the confines of the contract. So last year, we managed that by offering people the opportunity to buy tickets that would get them in for a one-day pass or a full pass downstairs at the office, which is open Monday through Thursday, 7:30 to 5:30, and also online. They could just print their stuff out and take it with them. We also did a bit of an honor system thing last year where if you showed up and you didn't have a ticket or a pass, we'd write your name down and tell you to go to the town office. And while I don't have the list specifically, it is so minor if people didn't pay that it's probably not worth even worrying about. So that would be what we would suggest again this year, if you want to charge people to get into the pool. That we would discuss during another time, I think. Give you a chance.
How much revenue do we get from pool pass?
So it fluctuates, but I think we were close to about 25% of the operating. So we're at about 40, with all told, we're at about $40,000 roughly for the pool operations. Right?
Yep.
And we were bringing in somewhere in the $10,000 to $14,000 range.
But more than half of that was for lessons.
Right.
So you're down to probably maybe 4,000, maybe 3,000 in pool passes. That a few years ago, we came to council and said this was definitely not going to be an endeavor that was ever going to break even. We had to look at it as an amenity. We've worked really hard to maximize pre-COVID, to maximize opportunities to build other money kind of in. So we are suggesting that we go back, we continue on with the no cash method, maintain the contract, ink another contract with the university to provide the service. Mitch is going to be looking at, are there ways that we can bring some benefit, more benefit, maybe on rainy days to have access? We don't know how that would work, if it would work, because the rec center has its own revenue goals and it functions as a cost center, much like the sewer would for us. It's got to break even on its own. So we've got to, I don't know how that would work. So those two things. The other thing that not having cash also impacts, or the ability to take cash at the site, is this idea of operating a concession stand, which we used to do prior to last year. That concession stand netted us about $1,000 a year in revenue. And what Mitch and I are thinking is, just as a matter of, on a very hot day, maybe it would be nice to just give out some popsicles. That is not the end of the world. That's $50 or so. To do that a few times a year seems like it would make sense, as opposed to having kids come with their quarters so that they can get their overpriced ice cream. I think that truly is a change in the level of service. We didn't have it before. We took it away because of COVID. I'm suggesting that it might be worth it to just leave it away and instead weave in the surprise days. Maybe it will encourage people to come more frequently. The flip side to that is we could probably try to hire somebody or buddies to be up there to manage cash and concessions, but you're probably going to be talking about another $6,000, $7,000 a year by the time we paid those people. I still have to train them separately. I still have to, all of those other things. So that's kind of the flip side.
Maybe you could get an ice cream cart, somebody who wants to sell ice cream on the
So
side.
I
Stick
wonder
it in the
if on
parking
hot
lot.
days, the ice cream guy might just, or person might just wander through
Right.
anyway. So the question in front of you is, are we good with going ahead with the university? Does that setup work for you, and should we budget and plan accordingly?
There were no swim lessons last year, right?
There were none here last year.
Right, will there be swim lessons, you think, this year?
So
If the university
I
can?
want to come back to, we don't know what staffing is going to be.
Okay. That's,
So
that's okay,
what we've created is our onion.
right,
And the swim lessons are definitely, it's the core, let's be open to let people have the experience. The next lap would be adding the swim lessons. The next after that would be trying to get some weekend availability.
Did we limit occupancy last summer?
We did, we limited at 50, at 50.
Are we planning to?
I think that's all up for debate based on what the best practices are at the time we open the pool. We can tell you that we never went over that, never had to turn anybody away. We had plans on how we would do that if we had to. But in the time that we were open, we never had to turn anybody away because we had.
I think from just talking to my neighbors and stuff, there was some people just didn't know, like, whether they were gonna show up or not, so maybe they put off the pool trip for a day, so if it would be possible for us to say, we're gonna let everybody know, that we would see increased use of the pool.
Yeah.
But, you know, of course, we have to wait and see what.
Yeah, I certainly think that's,
Situation is,
that, I mean, the plan is that we look at that in a way in which we can make it as, as available as possible to everybody. I think the other thing that really has helped us in this COVID time, and I think that we would look to continue that, is that in the past, we had brought summer camps in general swim, which jumps that number way up. By not doing that and having them have their own time before the regular pool opens, that really helped work in the fact that we weren't really getting huge numbers. So, having that, I think people were scared of going over that number and not wanting to do that, but we never hit that mark. So.
And I'd really like to reevaluate that as we get closer to the summer, just because just want to see what's going on with COVID. I mean, let's not forget that for the RSU, the policy to not mask outdoors was implemented at the beginning of this school year, and the outbreak that happened immediately at Asa Adams, a lot of that transmission happened outdoors on the playground. I think it's worth kind of waiting to see what happens with COVID numbers and whatnot as we decide about density in the pool, even though it's an outdoor space. That's no guarantee, unfortunately. But Sophie, yeah, I think all of that's reasonable. I would go, I mean, it does seem a little bit, as much as concessions are nice, it does seem a little odd to potentially staff and train for the, $6 or $7 grand for the summer for $1,000 concession stand profit. So I would be comfortable with not doing that.
The kids love those freezy pops for a quarter.
So my take on this is I'm fine with going with university. My goal would be to have the pool as accessible to the community as it can possibly be. Given what's been happening the last 2 years, and people really enjoy that amenity, and it is open as often, is open if we can possibly do weekends. I think that's great, and I think there's an equity issue here too, that not everybody can go to their summer camp and swim in their sparkling lake, and we need to be very concerned about that and make sure that it's as accessible to everybody as it can be.
And the kids around here, if they don't have the pool, they'll just jump in the river. So
Well, I mean,
it could be a safety issue too, to have the pool.
and I think we were positioned last year in a better place than some of our municipal counterparts because of our relationship with the university. And so I'm hoping that that will do kind of double duty. And what I have heard is that we also got a fairly decent candidate pool because they otherwise would have worked at the university, but they didn't want to be inside all the time. So I am, if you're good with moving that along, I'm not making promises, but I think Mitch and I certainly hear, how can we keep pricing low reasonable and open as much as we can in a safe way. The second one is maybe a little, not as easy, maybe, I don't know. Goose Landing, for the last 2 years, we have had security out at Goose Landing. A private company that we pay, they work with the police department, but they are in essence, they wander, they take care of parking, they call the police if there are issues. Their threshold for issues are probably lower than most of the participants' residents out there would be. It has, I think, worked well in terms of resident. We've heard a lot from residents out there that it has made a big difference in their enjoyment of their property out in that area. So we would be using a different company this year because we are no longer working with the same company. We had a disagreement we just had a disagreement with the way services were provided, and we have moved to a different company. That will cost about $20,000 a year. That is not something that we have grant funds for. This is clearly a behavior issue as opposed to a COVID issue at this point. And the available operations money is tightened up quite a bit. So I think we would have a really hard time classifying this as part of our FEMA grant. I think we would be remiss if we classified this as part of the ARPA grant because this is an ongoing operating expense, which I don't think we want to even try to work into those grant funds.
When you compare the complaints that we had gotten prior to using a security company
Yes.
with the level of satisfaction from residents, taxpayers with it, I'm in favor of continuing with what we've been doing.
What's the timeline? Like, when do they start? Do they start at the beginning of the summer and they go till?
Pretty much.
fall?
Last year, I think we started right around the 4th, and then we continued to right to the end of the summer, basically.
4th of July.
Yeah, 4th. It was a little late. Sometimes we'll go a little earlier than that, June.
Okay.
It really depends on when it starts warming up. We
Yeah.
would have conversations with the firm, the company we want to use, and then dial in the date when we were
But is
ready.
it 20,000 regardless if it starts in July or starts in, okay.
No, it's totally, that was pretty heavily managed in terms of thinking ahead. We didn't want them out there if it was raining. We
Right.
didn't want to, we tried to limit the expense. We tried to also, they're not out there all the time. I think it was noon to 5 or noon to 6.
We shifted
and-
depending upon what day it was and how the traffic, obviously Thursday, Friday, Saturdays were bigger days. We would have them out there longer hours, but then Mondays and Tuesdays they were shorter hours, so it balanced all out. But if it rained, they weren't there.
Right.
And that was the thing. The biggest challenge was being able to A, get somebody and B, get the cost of that person has gone up dramatically. We used to hire somebody in that position.
And Orono residents are still getting passes or stickers just to go out. to
So
Goose Landing?
everybody is.
Yeah.
Everybody, we ask people to sign in, and the reason that we do that is so that we have a record of who it is. If people are misbehaving and not doing the right thing, folks can oftentimes see this, just see it's not even a piece of
Piece of
paper.
paper.
Okay.
But they'll see it, the number corresponds with who took that out. And it gives us a way to track and have Ed Lesky go back and do community policing at its finest.
How has the presence of those security people cut down, not just on complaints and calls for PD, but things like maintenance issues, trash issues?
Oh, so Mitch usually takes care of the trash on Mondays. So I think he would tell you that if they tend to be in the actual container, which is always a benefit. I don't know that we're ever gonna have enough containers out there. I think we'll always fill them. I think too that I don't know that we're having to pull things out of the lake to the degree that we used to have to pull things out. I also think that we're not seeing some of the like parking in places that were causing erosion and things like that. I mean, I think there's definitely a benefit to what we're seeing. So based on what I'm hearing go forth and
Yes,
make contracts with people.
unless I hear any objection to that, that's, I think was a.
That's a good service.
Yep. Great.
Okay.
Is that all for that topic?
Yeah, we'll come back with, we'll piecemeal some more stuff, I'm sure.
You have a town manager's report?
I have a brief one. I wanted to let you know that Jeff Lowe and our deputy fire chief, Kevin Sirwa, did an absolutely amazing job on the Safer Grant. At 2:00 on Friday afternoon, I hit submit. It is a little over $740,000 over to be paid out over 3 years. I was truly impressed. If we don't get it, it's because other people must be able to cry better than we can, but it was truly, it was very good.
When do we expect to hear?
We would expect to hear by the end of June, early July, probably. Right now, Chief is down at the National Academy scoring, taking our turn scoring FEMA grants. And those are ones that we submitted a month and a half or 2 months ago. The committee scoring is just a piece of that. So it will go through, I think, a couple months. Also want to let you know that it looks like we will end up with 0.209%. So don't read that as 21%, but 0.209% of the state's, the money that the state is receiving from the opioid settlement. I've had some conversation with Attorney General Aaron Fry. He is still the same incredible guy that he was when he represented Orono. One of the things we're going to have to look at, though, if I've done my math right, which I probably haven't, it looks like it will be between $10,000 and $15,000 a year for the next 18 years. But it's not free money. It is restricted money. And we're going to have to think about how we want to use that. So my plan was to ask Jeff, Kevin, and Dan Merrill, maybe Scott LaJoy as well, to sit back, review. I've given them the criteria for the allowed uses of the money, and to come back to the Finance Committee with some suggestions to be able to move that forward. But I think we're going to have a pretty clear plan that will be adopted by council so that it doesn't just morph over time. Also want to let you know that we accepted a little over $50,000 of seized funds that had the court had seized the money, and we went through the asset forfeiture process. They gave us the funds. We, as we have been trained to do, immediately turned around and cut 15% check equal to 15% of that to the district attorney's office. The district attorney gave it back to us and said, oh, well, we would love this money. It was the state AG's office that actually pushed that forward. So we actually have that back. You'll probably see a correcting order coming up, but that is more money in asset forfeiture, which is great to see. We, the public safety team met, interviewed 4 firms to do the public safety and assessment. We did that on Friday. We have narrowed it down to a finalist. I left a message hoping to talk with them about a scope of work and a potential budget for us to go to council meeting on.
This is the building assessment.
This is the
Okay.
building assessment. The firm is not one that we have worked with before, but came with very, very high marks from departments and cities that we have worked with departmentally to know that we are kind of similar. So we're excited. My hope is that you'll see something on your February agenda, but if not February, it will be March. We are getting ready this week for our community services building facility assessment to be due. My hope is that Jeff and Tom will join Mitch and me to review those and perhaps do some interviews. I think I've seen some comment in the community, heard some comment in the community. I think what's really important with that assessment is that it's not as simple as what do we want to do. We're looking for best practices. We're looking for some general guidance on the building. And we're really also looking for some facilitation that is not driven by us who have our own thoughts, but rather open. And to really begin to talk with stakeholders about how things are kind of moving forward. So it's been busy, started bargaining, but we are making progress, and I think it will be a good cycle. And we'll have more for you likely as an update on the meeting on the 14th.
Thank you. Anything else to
I
come
will
before
get
us
you
tonight?
chocolates on the 14th.
Do you want to, I will get you whatever you want, you tell me. I happen to know where there's a little stash of nice dark chocolate.
I better refresh them then.
No, I'm good.
All
Are you
right,
ready to adjourn?
Yeah.
All right, then. Let's have a motion to adjourn from Cheryl,
So moved.
seconded by Jeff. And voting in favor. We will be adjourned until next Monday, at 5 o'clock for our regular meeting.
thank you all.
Cheryl, I have a favor to